David Strickland's suicide in a Las Vegas motel wasn't just a moment of despair, but the catastrophic crash of an unchecked manic spiral. This video exposes why the Suddenly Susan star stopped taking his lithium, trading his sanity for a fatal high. His death wasn't a mystery. It was the tragic result of a mental illness that convinced him he was invincible until the moment he wasn't. The tragedy of David Strickland is the tragedy of the sad clown, an archetype as old as performance itself. But in the context of 1990s Hollywood, this archetype was weaponized by a culture that demanded constant high-wattage happiness. David was born in 1969 in Glen Cove, New York, but he was truly born in the comedy clubs of Los Angeles. He arrived in Hollywood with a face that was a passport to success. He had the kind of soft, approachable features that casting directors love. Handsome but not threatening, funny but not abrasive. He was the boy next door with a quick wit. In the mid-90s, the television landscape was undergoing a seismic shift. The era of the family sitcom was fading, replaced by the hangout sitcoms, shows about beautiful 20-somethings navigating life in the city. Friends had rewritten the rules, and every network was scrambling for their own version. NBC found theirs in Suddenly Susan, a vehicle designed to launch Brooke Shields into the stratosphere of television comedy. But every star needs an anchor, a foil, someone to ground the absurdity. David Strickland was cast as that anchor. From the moment he walked onto the soundstage, the chemistry was palpable. He didn't just recite lines, he danced with them. He had an innate sense of rhythm, a physical looseness that made Todd Stites feel like a real person rather than a scripted character. He played the air guitar, he wore vintage bowling shirts, he had a lopsided grin that could disarm the stiffest critic. The audience fell in love with him instantly. He became the breakout star, the fan favorite, who stole scenes without ever trying to overshadow the lead. By 1998, David Strickland was living the life that every waiter in Los Angeles prays for. He was earning a massive salary. He was dating Tiffany Thiessen, one of the most desirable women in the world, famous for her roles in Saved by the Bell and Beverly Hills 90210. He was on the covers of magazines. He was filming a blockbuster movie, Forces of Nature, alongside Ben Affleck and Sandra Bullock. He had ascended to the pantheon. He had made it. But the view from the top of the mountain is often terrifying when you are standing on a foundation that is crumbling. Behind the scenes, the boy next door was fighting a battle that no script could resolve. David Strickland was mentally ill. This is not a term we use lightly or metaphorically. He had been clinically diagnosed with bipolar disorder. For those who have never experienced the pendulum swing of this condition, it is difficult to describe the violence of it. It is not simply mood swings, it is a biological hijacking of the self. On one side, there is the depression, a black suffocating gravity that makes getting out of bed feel like lifting a car. In these phases, David would disappear. The light in his eyes would extinguish. He would stare into the middle distance, unable to connect, unable to feel, trapped in a silent gray hell. On the other side, there is the mania. And for an actor, the mania is the more dangerous of the two beasts because it feels like a gift. In a manic state, the brain fires at a velocity that defies physics. You feel invincible. You feel brilliant. You are the funniest person in the room. You don't need sleep. You don't need food. You are a god. For a comedian, this energy is seductive. It fuels the improvisation, the quick comebacks, the electric presence that the camera loves. David's career was, in many ways, built on the back of his hypomania. The industry rewarded his illness. They applauded his energy. They paid him millions for his spark. They didn't realize that the spark was actually a wildfire, burning him alive from the inside out. To manage this chemical storm, doctors prescribed lithium. Lithium is a miracle drug for stabilizing bipolar disorder. It cuts the highs and lifts the lows. It creates a middle ground where life is livable. But for an artist, lithium can feel like a lobotomy of the soul. It takes away the edge, it dulls the colors. David often complained that when he was on his medication, he couldn't feel the comedy. He felt flat. He felt boring. He felt like he was losing the very thing that made him special. And so, in the fatal arithmetic of the tortured artist, he made a choice. He chose the art over the sanity. In the months leading up to his death, David Strickland stopped taking his medication. This decision was the first step on the road to room 20. Without the chemical guardrails, his brain was left unguarded against the stressors of his life. And the stressors were mounting. Hollywood is a pressure cooker. The schedule of a network sitcom is grueling. Long hours, constant rewrites, the pressure to be funny on command week after week. David was also struggling with addiction. This is the dark companion of bipolar disorder. When the mania is too high, you drink to come down. When the depression is too low, you do cocaine to get up. David was caught in this cycle of self-medication. He had been arrested for a DUI in October 1998, a public humiliation that cracked his pristine image. He was sentenced to probation and ordered to attend Alcoholics Anonymous. He tried. By all accounts, he really tried. He went to the meetings, he spoke about his struggles. But the sobriety was fragile because the underlying mental illness was untreated. He was white-knuckling his way through life, holding on to the edge of the cliff with greased fingers. The cast and crew of Suddenly Susan knew he was struggling, but they didn't know the depth of the abyss. They saw the sad clown, the guy who would be crying in his dressing room one minute and cracking jokes the next. They loved him. They protected him, but they couldn't cure him. Brooke Shields, in particular, was fiercely protective. She sensed the fragility in him. She knew that beneath the bravado was a terrified child who didn't know how to turn off the noise in his head. Then came the catalyst, the event that would push him from struggling to spiraling. It was the movie Forces of Nature. This film was supposed to be his graduation. It was a major studio production, a romantic comedy that was guaranteed to be a hit. David had filmed a substantial role. He had spent months on set, believing that this was his moment to shine on the big screen. He poured his manic energy into the performance. He told his friends, his family, his girlfriend that this was going to be big. But the editing room is a slaughterhouse. As the release date approached, the studio executives decided the film was too long. They needed to cut for time. And when you need to cut time, you don't cut Ben Affleck. You cut the supporting guy. You cut David Strickland. In mid-March 1999, just days before his death, David attended a screening or saw a cut of the film. We can only imagine the visceral horror of that moment. He sat in the dark, waiting for his scenes, waiting for the jokes he had crafted, waiting for his validation. And he watched as they didn't happen. His role had been eviscerated. He was reduced to a background player, a plot device. The narrative arc he had built was gone. For a stable mind, this is a professional disappointment. It stings, but you move on. You cash the check and look for the next gig. But for a mind in the grip of unmedicated bipolar disorder, this was not a disappointment. It was a confirmation. It was a message from the universe that whispered, "You are a failure. You are a fraud. You don't matter." The rejection triggered a catastrophic psychological collapse. It likely sparked a mixed state, the most lethal condition in psychiatry, where the agitation and energy of mania combined with the hopelessness and self-hatred of depression. In a mixed state, you have the desire to die, and crucially, you have the energy to execute the plan. David needed to escape the feeling. He needed to outrun the shame. He needed to obliterate his consciousness. And there is only one place in America designed specifically for the obliteration of the self. There is only one place where the lights are bright enough to blind you to your own thoughts. He looked at the calendar. He had a court appearance scheduled for Monday morning in Los Angeles, a progress report on his sobriety. He had a life that demanded responsibility. He had a girlfriend who loved him. He had a job. But the voice of the mania was louder than all of them. It told him to run. It told him to find the chaos. He picked up the phone. He didn't call his sponsor. He didn't call Brooke Shields. He called a friend who was synonymous with chaos. He called Andy Dick. And with that phone call, the final act began. They bought tickets to Las Vegas. They boarded the plane. David Strickland was leaving Hollywood, but he wasn't going on a vacation. He was going on a pilgrimage to his own destruction. The sad clown was taking off his makeup, and beneath the paint, there was nothing left but pain. When the wheels of the plane touched down on the tarmac of McCarran International Airport on Saturday, March 20th, 1999, David Strickland was no longer David Strickland. He was a raw nerve ending. He was a biological engine running on a fuel mixture of adrenaline, despair, and unmedicated mania. He had left Los Angeles to escape the silence of his own failure, the crushing disappointment of forces of nature. And he had come to the one place on earth designed to ensure that silence never finds you. Las Vegas is not just a city. It is a machine. It is a sensory deprivation tank in reverse, flooding the brain with so much light, noise, and possibility that it drowns out the internal monologue. For a man in a manic state, Vegas is not a playground. It is an accelerant. It takes the fire already burning in the mind and pours gasoline on it. But David did not descend into the underworld alone. Sitting beside him was a figure who would become the dark antagonist of this tragedy, a man whose name has since become synonymous with the destruction of Hollywood talent, Andy Dick. To understand the toxicity of this weekend, we must pause and examine the dynamic between these two men. Andy Dick, the star of news radio, was a brilliant, chaotic, and profoundly troubled comedian. In the ecosystem of 90s comedy, he was the Lord of Misrule. He was the guy who pushed every boundary, who turned every night out into a piece of performance art that often ended in disaster. For David, who was the nice guy, the boy next door, struggling to contain his demons, Andy was the ultimate enabler. He was the permission slip. When you are with Andy Dick, there are no rules. There is no time to go home. There is only the next drink, the next club, the next laugh. There is a grim historical context to Andy Dick's presence in this story. Just a year prior, in 1998, Andy had been present at a Christmas party with Bryn Hartman, the wife of comedy legend Phil Hartman. Bryn was a recovering addict, fragile and fighting for her sobriety. Reports suggest that it was at this party in Andy's orbit that she relapsed on cocaine. That relapse triggered the psychotic break that led her to murder Phil Hartman in his sleep before killing herself. Andy Dick was not the murderer, but in the eyes of the Hollywood community, he was the carrier of the virus. He was the chaotic element that destabilized fragile systems. And now he was in Las Vegas with David Strickland, a man who was hanging by a thread. It was a pairing that had doom written all over it from the moment they boarded the plane. The itinerary of that weekend is a blur of neon and shadow, reconstructed from credit card receipts, eyewitness accounts, and the fragmented memories of those who saw them. They didn't go to the museums. They didn't go to the shows. They went straight for the jugular of the city's vice. They hit the strip clubs. Las Vegas strip clubs are specific places. They are windowless, timeless voids where money loses its meaning and intimacy is a transaction. For a man like David, who was feeling profoundly unloved and rejected by his industry, the artificial adoration of the dancers was likely a potent drug. He threw money around with reckless abandon. This is a classic symptom of mania, financial hemorrhaging. The sufferer believes their resources are infinite. They tip $100 bills for a smile. They buy rounds for the whole bar. They are trying to buy a feeling of grandeur to replace the feeling of worthlessness. Saturday night bled into Sunday morning without a pause. In a manic episode, the body's need for sleep vanishes. The circadian rhythm is shattered. David was likely awake for 24, 36, perhaps 48 hours straight. Consider the physiology of this. The brain is flooded with dopamine and norepinephrine. The synapses are firing uncontrollably. But without sleep to wash away the toxins, the brain begins to malfunction. Paranoia sets in. The euphoria starts to curdle into agitation. The fun stops being fun and starts being a desperate, sweaty compulsion. You keep drinking not to get drunk, but to stop the shaking. You keep moving because if you stop, the crash will kill you. David and Andy were a two-man hurricane, tearing through the casinos and the bars. But at some point during this 72-hour bender, the dynamic shifted. The fun ran out. We don't know exactly what happened between them. Did they fight? Did David's behavior become too dark, too erratic, even for Andy Dick? Or did the simple reality of Monday morning intervene? Andy Dick had a life to return to. He had a job. He had a survival instinct that, despite his chaos, often kicked in right before the point of no return. Sometime on Sunday or early Monday, Andy Dick made the decision to leave. He headed to McCarran Airport. He boarded a plane back to Los Angeles. He left David Strickland behind. This abandonment is the psychological turning point of the entire story. Up until this moment, David was on a party trip with a friend. It was a bender, yes, but it was a social event. There was camaraderie. There was a witness to his madness. But when Andy left, the narrative changed instantly. David was no longer a guy partying in Vegas. He was a mentally ill man, off his medication, exhausted, intoxicated, and alone in a city that eats the lonely. The silence that descended on David must have been deafening. The manic energy that had sustained him for 2 days began to evaporate, revealing the jagged rocks of depression beneath. This is the crash. And for a bipolar brain, the crash from a manic high is not just sadness. It is a physiological horror. It is a chemical freefall. The shame would have hit him like a physical blow. He had missed his court date in Los Angeles. He had relapsed. He had blown thousands of dollars. He had likely ruined his relationship with Tiffany Thiessen. He had proven the studio executives right. He was a mess. He stood at a crossroads. He could have gone to the airport. He could have flown home, faced the judge, faced Brooke Shields, faced the music. He could have checked into a hospital. But the logic of the suicidal mind is not linear. It is a tunnel. And in that tunnel, David saw only one light. He didn't go to the airport. Instead, he made a choice that signals a profound shift in his intent. He checked out of the hotel where they had been staying, likely a nice strip-adjacent hotel, and he sought out something different. He didn't want luxury anymore. He didn't want to be David Strickland TV star. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to go to the bottom. He hailed a cab and directed the driver away from the Bellagio, away from the Mirage, away from the glittering facade of the New Vegas. He went south past the Luxor, past the Mandalay Bay to the gritty, forgotten end of the Strip. He pulled up to the Oasis Motel. The Oasis Motel was a relic. It was a single-story U-shaped complex of stucco bungalows that belonged to a different era of Vegas, the era of mobsters and drifters. By 1999, it was a flophouse. It was a place where you paid cash, where no one asked questions, and where the Do Not Disturb sign was a legally binding contract. It was cheap, dirty, and anonymous. It was the architectural equivalent of giving up. There is a chilling detail about this location that adds a layer of noir mysticism to the tragedy. Just 4 months prior, in November 1998, the world-famous poker player Stu Ungar had been found dead in the Oasis Motel. Ungar was a genius, a prodigy of cards who had won the World Series of Poker 3 times. But he was also a slave to cocaine, and he had died alone in room 6 of the Oasis, his heart giving out after years of abuse. Did David know this? Did he choose the Oasis because it was already a graveyard for tortured geniuses? Or was it just a grim coincidence, a magnetic pull that draws broken men to the same dark corners? David walked into the front office. He was wearing the clothes he had partied in for 3 days. He looked disheveled, wired, and exhausted. He paid for a room. He was given the key to room 20. Room 20. It was a small, nondescript box, a bed with a cheap floral spread, a television bolted to the table, a bathroom with flickering fluorescent lights. This was the final set piece of his life. It was a long way from the soundstage at NBC. It was a long way from the red carpet. But David wasn't done yet. He wasn't ready to turn off the lights immediately. He needed one last connection, one last human touch to validate his existence before he erased it. He didn't call his famous girlfriend. He didn't call his co-stars. He engaged the services of a sex worker. This interaction is the most poignant scene in the entire narrative. A woman came to room 20. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know he was on the cover of magazines. She just saw a sad, handsome guy who seemed desperate for company. They spent time together. We don't know the details of their conversation, but we can surmise that it wasn't about sex. It was about intimacy. It was about holding on to another living being while the darkness closed in. As she prepared to leave, David did something extraordinary. He reportedly gave her all the cash he had left. It was a significant amount. And then he looked at her with those soft, sad eyes, the eyes of Todd Stites, the eyes of the boy from New York, and he delivered a line that sounds like it was written for a ghost. Significant changes are about to happen in your life. It was a prophecy. It was a benediction. He was changing her life with the money, yes, but he was also signaling the end of his own. He was passing the torch of existence to a stranger in a motel room. She walked out the door. The latch clicked shut. The sound of her footsteps faded on the pavement outside. Now, it was just David. The room was quiet. The TV might have been humming with the low static of cable news. The air conditioner rattled. The mania was gone, replaced by a clarity that is terrifying in its finality. He was sober now, or at least sober enough to see the wreckage of his life with blinding precision. He saw the court date he missed. He saw the movie that cut him. He saw the emptiness of the industry that loved him only when he was smiling. He looked up at the ceiling. He saw the exposed beam. He looked at the bed. He saw the sheets. The spiral was over. The car had hit the wall. The sad clown had told his last joke, and there was no one left in the audience to laugh. David Strickland stood up, and he began to prepare for the only scene he had left to play. In the sprawling, sun-drenched narrative of Los Angeles, silence is a commodity that is rarely purchased. The city is a machine of constant noise, the hum of the freeways, the ring of the telephones, the chatter of the agents, the applause of the studio audiences. But on the morning of Monday, March 22, 1999, A terrifying silence descended upon the life of David Strickland. It began in a municipal courtroom in downtown Los Angeles, where a judge sat waiting. It was a routine hearing, a progress report on a DUI charge that was supposed to be a mere formality in the actor's rehabilitation. The clerk called the name David Gordon Strickland. There was no answer. The lawyer looked around the room, checking his watch, shifting his papers, offering the standard excuses of traffic or confusion. But the empty chair spoke louder than any legal defense. In the judicial system, an absence is a contempt of court. In the ecosystem of a recovering addict, an absence is a siren screaming of relapse or worse. At the same time, miles away on the soundstage of Suddenly Susan, the silence was metastasizing into panic. In the regimented world of network television, punctuality is godliness. A star does not simply vanish. If a star is late, an assistant calls. If an assistant doesn't call, a producer calls. If the producer gets no answer, the machinery of Hollywood crisis management grinds into gear. But the reaction to David's absence that morning was not the typical annoyance of a production team dealing with a flaky actor. It was immediate, visceral terror. Brooke Shields, the star of the show and David's maternal protector, did not assume he had overslept. She did not assume he was stuck in traffic on the 405. She assumed, with a chilling intuition born of witnessing his fragility up close, that something catastrophic had occurred. This is where the narrative shifts from a tragedy of mental health into the shadows of a noir detective story. The speed of the response defies the standard timeline of a missing persons case. Usually, the police require a waiting period. Usually, friends make a few calls to hospitals before assuming the worst. But Brooke Shields and the inner circle of David Strickland didn't call the hospitals. They called a private investigator. The hiring of a private detective is a specific admission. It admits that the official channels are too slow, too public, or too clumsy to handle the truth. The investigator hired was a specialist in the dark arts of Hollywood fix-it work, a man who knew how to find people who didn't want to be found. He didn't waste time driving around Los Angeles looking for David's car. He went straight to the digital footprint. In 1999, the electronic leash was not as tight as it is today, but credit cards still left a breadcrumb trail for those who knew how to access the data. The trail lit up almost immediately. It didn't point to a hideout in the Hollywood Hills. It pointed east, across the desert, to the neon graveyard of Las Vegas. And it didn't point to the Bellagio or the MGM Grand, where the high rollers sat. It pointed to a charge at a place called the Oasis Motel. The investigator moved with the efficiency of a predator. He flew to Las Vegas. He rented a car. He drove down the Strip, past the architectural marvels of the new casinos, past the pyramids and the pirate ships, until the city began to fray at the edges. He pulled into the cracked asphalt lot of the Oasis. It was the afternoon of March 22nd. The sun was high and unforgiving, bleaching the color out of the stucco walls. The investigator approached the front desk. He showed a photo. He asked about a guest. The clerk confirmed that a man matching the description was in room 20. He walked to the door. He knocked. There was no answer. The silence inside room 20 was heavy, a physical weight pressing against the wood. The investigator didn't kick down the door. He summoned the manager. A key was produced. The lock turned with a mechanical click that sounded like the closing of a casket. The door swung open. The air inside the room was stale, a mixture of cheap motel disinfectant, stale tobacco smoke, and the metallic scent of emptiness. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the Nevada sun. And there, in the dim light, the search ended. David Strickland was not sleeping off a hangover. He was not hiding. He was suspended. He had used a bedsheet. He had twisted it into a ligature, thrown it over a ceiling beam, and ended his life. The scene was stark, devoid of the glamour that had defined his public existence. There were empty beer bottles, the remnants of the final party. There were cigarettes, but there was no suicide note. This absence of a final missive is common in impulsive suicides driven by mania. But to the grieving mind, it feels like a missing chapter, a puzzle with the centerpiece removed. The investigator called the police. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department arrived. Sirens cut through the dry afternoon air. Crime scene tape was strung up across the door of room 20, turning the cheap motel into a spectacle. The body was cut down. The pockets were searched. They found his wallet. They found the ID that identified him as David Strickland, the star of Forces of Nature. The police saw a clear-cut case, a celebrity overdose, a bender gone wrong, a suicide in a lonely room. They processed the scene quickly. Las Vegas is a city that relies on the illusion of happiness. A dead celebrity in a flophouse is bad for business. The quicker the body is moved to the coroner, the quicker the tourist can forget. But as the initial shock wore off and the details of the autopsy and the crime scene photos began to circulate in the whispers of the industry, questions began to arise. These questions formed the bedrock of the conspiracy theories that still haunt the forums of internet sleuths today. The first anomaly was the physical condition of the body. The coroner's report noted abrasions, scrapes and bruises on David's knees and legs. The official explanation was that these were likely old injuries, perhaps sustained during the chaotic 3-day bender with Andy Dick, maybe from falling down in a club or stumbling on the street. Or, darker still, they were evidence of practice runs, failed attempts to hang himself before the final successful act. But to the conspiratorial mind, bruises tell a different story. They suggest a struggle. They suggest that perhaps David didn't go up on that beam willingly. Was it a debt collection gone wrong? Was it a drug deal that turned violent? The theory of a stage-managed suicide is a staple of noir fiction. And for those who couldn't accept that the lovable Todd Stites would kill himself, it became a seductive alternative narrative. Then there was the timeline. The speed at which Brooke Shields and the production team moved from David is missing to David is dead was startling. Within hours of him missing court, they had a body. This efficiency speaks to a terrifying truth. They knew he was on the edge. They knew about the gun. There were reports that David had purchased a handgun days before the trip, though he didn't take it to Vegas. The knowledge of this weapon likely fueled the panic in Los Angeles. They weren't looking for a missing person. They were racing to stop a bullet. The fact that he chose a bedsheet instead of a gun is a detail that psychologists analyze endlessly. Did he forget the gun? Did he sell it for drugs? Or was the bedsheet an impulsive decision made in the quiet horror of the motel room, a crime of opportunity against himself? The media frenzy that followed was a study in contrasts. On the newsstands, People magazine and Entertainment Weekly were featuring glowing reviews of Forces of Nature. David was smiling next to Ben Affleck, looking like the future of Hollywood. On the television news, aerial footage showed the grim flat roof of the Oasis Motel. The juxtaposition was jarring. It exposed the lie of the industry. It showed the public that the image on the screen is a ghost, distinct and separate from the flesh and blood human being who suffers. And then, inevitably, the focus turned to Andy Dick. Andy was back in Los Angeles when the news broke. He was alive. He was safe. But in the court of public opinion, he was an accessory. He was the man who had piloted the plane into the storm and then parachuted out before the crash. The narrative hardened around him. He left him. Why did he leave a manic, suicidal friend alone in Las Vegas? Why didn't he call someone? Why didn't he take David with him? Andy's reaction to the death did nothing to quell the anger. He didn't play the part of the grieving friend well. He was defensive. He made off-color jokes. He seemed to view the tragedy as another absurd plot twist in the sitcom of his life rather than a devastating loss of human life. This behavior cemented the curse of Andy Dick mythology. He became the villain of the piece, the angel of death, who had now presided over the destruction of two beloved comic actors, Phil Hartman and David Strickland, in less than a year. But the most haunting mystery remained inside the Oasis motel itself. It wasn't just the bruises, and it wasn't just the Andy Dick connection. It was the uncanny magnetism of that specific location. Just months prior, the legendary Stu Ungar had died in room 6, just a few doors down from where David took his last breath in room 20. Was it a coincidence? Mathematically, the odds are astronomical. Two famous men, both geniuses in their fields, both destroyed by their addictions, drawn to the same dilapidated motel at the edge of the world within 4 months of each other. Some suggested that David knew. They suggested that in his manic state he sought out the Oasis as a shrine, a final resting place for broken legends. As the coroner's van pulled away from the Oasis motel, carrying the body of David Strickland back to the morgue, the sun began to set over the Strip. The lights of the casinos flickered on, the gold of the Mandalay Bay, the green of the MGM, the white of the Bellagio. The party was starting again. The slot machines were singing. The tourists were pouring drinks. Las Vegas did not pause for David Strickland. It did not mourn. It simply reset the room. The sheets would be changed. The floor would be vacuumed. And room 20 would be ready for the next guest, the next secret, the next tragedy, the next